Thank you. Thank you. Your Excellency, Minister Rasmus Helveg Petersen of Denmark, and Your Excellency, Minister Manuel Pulga Vidal, Minister of Environment of Peru, who is going to be the President of UNFCCC COP20 in Peru. Honorable Dr. Rajendra Pachauri, President of IPCC, Excellencies, distinguished members, scientists of IPCC, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to speak a few words in this historic occasion of launching the synthesis report of the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. We are, I think, here at the very historic and crucially important timing for humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, sound science must be at the core of our efforts to meet the challenge of climate change. For more than a quarter century, the IPCC has been at the forefront of increasing understanding about this issue, climate change. Most recently, the IPCC provided the scientific foundation for the successful climate summit that I hosted in New York this September. It brought together government leaders, business executives, and finance officials, and many civil society leaders. They all expressed strong commitment for a meaningful universal climate agreement. Public and private financing sources show the way forward for mobilizing funds. We made progress on carbon pricing, strengthening resilience, and forming new coalitions to meet the climate challenge. The summit had enormous popular support. Hundreds of thousands of people marched in New York City and other major cities to demand climate action around the world. I was inspired myself to see so many global citizens taking to the streets and raising their voices loud and clear. While marching together with them, I hope that the world leaders should and could lead their voices. The report we are launching today, the IPCC's fifth assessment, was compiled by hundreds of scientists from around the world. It is the most comprehensive appraisal of climate change ever taken. This report offers three key messages. One, human influence on the climate system is clear and clearly growing. We must act, second, we must act quickly and decisively if we want to avoid increasingly destructive outcomes. Three, we have the means to limit climate change and build a better future. The report found that the world is largely very ill prepared for the risks of changing climate, especially the poor and most vulnerable who have contributed least to this problem. The atmosphere and oceans have warmed. The amounts of snow and ice have diminished. Sea levels have risen. I have seen for myself those rapidly melting glaciers, most recently in Greenland, together with the Prime Minister of Denmark, Her Excellency Helle Thorning-Schmidt. As I'm not a scientist, I may not be able to speak in a scientific way. That is why, during last 8 years as a Secretary General, I have been traveling all around the world, wherever and whenever. I was able to see the impact for myself so that I could add to the voices of scientists in a political way, as a common man, without knowing scientists. But whatever I saw, I conveyed from the scenes, from Antarctica, North Pole, Amazon River basins, Lake Chad, Aral Seas. Please name any places which I have not been there. That much I am committed, I have been committed. And I'm really adding my political voice to what scientists have been working very, very hard. And I really appreciate. If we continue business as usual, our opportunity to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees centigrade will slip away within the next decades. Even if emissions stopped tomorrow, we will be living with the climate change for some time to come. The good news is that if we act now, immediately and decisively, we have the means to build a better and more sustainable world. Many tools and technologies are already available. Renewable energy sources are increasingly economically competitive. Energy efficiency has long proven its value. Action on climate change can contribute to economic prosperity, better health, and more livable cities, while reducing the risks of further environmental degradation. Economic growth and climate action can be mutually reinforcing. There is a myth which is shared unscientifically, uneconomically, that climate action will cost heavily. But I'm telling you that inaction of climate action will cost much, much more. This climate action and economic growth are two sides of just one coin. With this due synthesis report, science has spoken yet again with much more clarity and greater certainty. Citizens are increasingly restive, but also eager to seize the opportunities of building a sustainable future. Ladies and gentlemen, taking this opportunity, I'd like to thank most sincerely to all the scientists of the IPCC who have done outstanding work in showing the world the perils of climate inaction and the potential of climate action. You do not answer to any interest except our planet and the truth. You are trusted and most respected around the world. You have been at the center of the global dialogue on climate since long before people started marching in the streets demanding action. You and the hundreds of scientists around the world who contribute to the IPCC provide the hard evidence we need to make a change in our world and human history. This report gives a major push to the discussions at the climate conference in Lima in December and to success in Paris next year. Without a global agreement, we will not mobilize action to the extent necessary to get the world onto a 2-degree pathway. Science has spoken. There is no ambiguity in their message. Leaders must act. Time is not on our side. Let's work together to make this world, our only planet Earth, sustainable, economically, socially, environmentally, for our succeeding generation. Let us preserve our planet Earth, only planet Earth, in a sustainable way. Thank you very much for your leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary General. And I'd now request Renate Christ to make a statement.
Thank you very much. I would just like to provide you a brief overview of what the IPCC is and how it works. IPCC was established to provide comprehensive, objective and balanced information for decision makers. It does not conduct its own research, but it assesses the thousands of relevant scientific papers published each year and assesses what we know and also what we don't know about the risks of climate change and about options for tackling these risks. IPCC reports are prepared by teams of renowned experts from all regions of the world and according to clearly defined rules. Repeated reviews by experts and by governments of the draft reports is an essential part of the process of developing IPCC reports. As the Secretary General has already mentioned, the scientists who work on these reports are volunteers, donating their time and expertise, and I want to also take this opportunity to thank all of them for their dedication and for their hard work over the past years. IPCC is an intergovernmental process. Governments request the preparation of reports, and at the end of the assessment process, they approve the final report, which signifies that they agree with the scientific findings. This approval process, which we have gone through in the past week, is a dialogue between the experts and between the government representatives who are the users of the report. And this element of dialogue was brought home to me in discussions with delegates, like after we have approved a new figure which shows the risks at various ranges of temperature increases and the cumulative emissions which determine the temperature increase, and then the corresponding emission limitations and reductions by the year 2050. And delegates said, well, after the explanation of the author, I understand now the science much better, and now I can really brief my minister. Over the past 2 decades, the fields of expertise who contribute to IPCC reports have been constantly growing, from atmospheric and natural scientists to include economists, engineers, other practitioners, social scientists, and philosophers. This unique cooperation across disciplines allows a comprehensive view of the climate change problem, its causes, how it affects humans and natural systems, and what to do about, and which is presented in an integrated manner in the synthesis report which you have before you and which will now be presented by Dr. Pachauri, Chairman of the IPCC.
Thank you very much, Renata. And I'd now ask Dr. Pachauri to present the AR5 synthesis report.
Your Excellency, Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, Honorable Minister of State for Environment from Peru, Mr. Pulgar Vidal, who is also, as you've heard, going to be the president of COP20 to be held in Lima, Peru, Secretary General of the WMO, one of the founding organizations of the IPCC, Mr. Michel Giraud, Secretary of the IPCC, Renate Christ, Head Communications Media Relations IPCC, Mr. Jonathan Lin, and my colleague, Dr. Leo Mayer, Head of the Technical Support Unit of the Synthesis Report. Let me at the outset express my deep gratitude to His Excellency the Secretary General. This is the second time that he has come to release a synthesis report produced by the IPCC, and we know the value of your time, sir, the many pressures that exist on it. And your presence over here is a clear indication of the enormous commitment and deep interest you have in the world coming up with solutions to this growing challenge of climate change. And I want to say on behalf of the scientific community and the IPCC, the support that you've been providing to the science related to climate change really requires us to express a deep level of gratitude for your enormous and continuing support. I'm delighted to present the synthesis report in this particular cycle, and this report really sets a new benchmark in scientific assessment. For one thing, the synthesis report brings together all the elements of the puzzle that constitute the various aspects of climate change, right from the underlying physical science basis to the impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, and the kinds of mitigation options that we have available to us. This report has involved over 800 authors directly and thousands more reviewers and authors. And we assessed altogether about 30,000 publications in coming up with this assessment. And it really comes at an important time when the global community is looking for ways to tackle climate change. I want to pay my tribute to the tireless work of both the authors of the report as well as governments that guide the process of its approval, its final shape in terms of how we express scientific findings in a manner that can be understood by a non-specialist audience. I want to emphasize the fact that climate change will leave no part of the world untouched by the impacts that we are seeing before our eyes, and that obviously are going to be of growing relevance in the future. And by weaving together the strands of the three working group reports, we have created a document that helps policymakers make sense of all the elements as I mentioned. I think it's very clear that to avoid the chaos of runaway climate change, we know what we need to dramatically reduce global emissions of greenhouse gases. And I think we need to lead to a future that has much lower intensity in the use of those activities that contribute to emissions of greenhouse gases. It also projects the risks and the expensive and often unquantifiable and destabilizing impacts of a high carbon path of development and growth. While the IPCC does not make any recommendations, policymakers, I'm sure, will benefit greatly from seeing the implications of the two alternative development pathways side by side. And as His Excellency, the Secretary General, very eloquently mentioned, we need to look at the path of inaction and where that would lead us, and the attractiveness of the path of action that really can help us meet this growing challenge. As I said when I opened the meeting last week, we have provided a roadmap by which policymakers can find their way to a global agreement to tackle climate change within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And I'm very grateful to my good friend, the Honorable Minister from Peru, who's going to guide the discussions and deliberations and the direction that we get from Peru, which I think is going to be an extremely important step in determining the success of the following Conference of the Parties in Paris. So the scientific community has now spoken, but we are passing on the baton to politicians, to the decision-making community, and of course, as His Excellency the Secretary General has reminded us, the various protest marches that took place in New York and elsewhere in the world are a clear expression of the interest that civil society and people at large are showing. Now, what I would like to do is I'd like to present very briefly some of the main elements of the findings of this report, and I'll make a beginning with that now. Well, human influence on the climate system is clear. The more we disrupt our climate, the more we risk severe, pervasive, and irreversible impacts. Fortunately, we have the means, as His Excellency the Secretary General mentioned, the good news that we have the means to limit climate change and build a more prosperous, sustainable future. Now, if we look at the impact that human actions have had on the climate, these figures will show you that it's extremely likely, which denotes a probability of over 95%, that we are the dominant cause of warming since the mid-20th century. And you can see the data presented over here, which shows this very sharp increase after the middle of the last century. It's also true that each of the past 3 decades has been successively warmer than the preceding decades since 1850. And if you look at where the heat has gone, this is a major finding of the fifth assessment report. More than 90% of the energy accumulating in the climate system between 71 and 2010 has accumulated in the oceans. So in a sense, the oceans are bearing a large part of the burden that we have imposed on this planet in the form of climate change. And land temperatures remain at historic highs, while ocean temperatures continue to climb as the heat keeps sinking to lower depths in the ocean. GHG emissions, unfortunately, continue to grow. And in the period 2000 to 2010, which, if I may mention, has incidentally also been characterized by a period of economic downturn, still, between 2000 and 2010, emissions have grown much faster than in previous decades. So there is need for us to bring about a major change to this very disturbing trend. The sources of emissions come 35% from the energy sector, 24% from agriculture, forestry, and other land uses. Now, this is something that the fifth assessment report has focused on with due importance to this particular sector. 21% from industry, 14% from transport, and 6.4% from the building sector. Now, if you look at globally average combined land and ocean surface temperature, and this combines the two, this is the kind of picture we get, beginning with the middle of the 19th century. And if we look at globally average sea level change, this again is something that causes concern, because average sea level rise since the beginning of the last century to 2010 has been 19 centimeters. And for several parts of the world, that certainly rings a lot of alarm bells. If we look at globally average greenhouse gas concentrations, you can see CO2, which is shown as green, which is not necessarily an indicator of how green this gas is, has grown far faster than the other two. You don't see nitrous oxide, which is to the right on a scale that unfortunately can't be shown on this figure, but you see that methane and nitrous oxide have grown not as fast as carbon dioxide. And if you look at global anthropogenic, that means human-induced CO2 emissions, these have grown very rapidly since the beginning of the last century in particular. And you see fossil fuels, cement, and flaring as the major cause, but forestry and other land use have also been a cause. Now, if we put all these figures together, we get an integrated view, and I would submit that this is the kind of synthesis that the synthesis report is able to provide, so that you get an integrated view of what's happening to our climate and what are the causes and what we can do about it. Some changes in extreme weather and climate events observed since about 1950 have been linked to human influence. Tropics to the poles have been impacted by climate change on all continents and in the ocean, affecting rich and poor countries. And we know that continued emissions will lead to oceans warming during the 21st century. And it's very likely that Arctic sea ice cover will continue to shrink, and that a global mean surface temperature, as global mean surface temperature rises. In fact, we have projected, Secretary General, that in one of the scenarios, it shows that by the middle of this century, Arctic sea ice may not be seen during the month of September. Global mean sea level will continue to rise during the 21st, and global glacier volume will also shrink further. There'll be impacts on food and water, increased poverty, increased displacement of people, and coastal flooding. Now, as it happens, the window of action is really closing very rapidly. So we have a very short window of opportunity. If you look at the total carbon budget to ensure that temperature increase by the end of this century will not exceed 2 degrees Celsius, we've already used up a substantial share of this. What's remaining for us is only 275 gigatons of carbon. So this clearly shows that we have a very limited window of opportunity, and I think the global community must look at these numbers and show the resolve by which we can bring about change. If you look at what it might do to agriculture, What we have over here is for different periods, the blue lines indicate the beneficial impacts on agriculture in terms of increased yields, and the brown and yellow lines show decrease that would take place. And if we do nothing, then by the end of the century, you can see the substantial decrease in yields that would take place. And with a growing population and higher incomes, you can imagine food scarcity and food security and the whole issue of starvation and hunger become very large threats for human society. Now, stabilization of atmospheric concentrations require moving away from the baseline, which is shown with that band in crimson on the right. And one of the scenarios that we have assessed, which is a stringent mitigation scenario, will take us to actually below zero emissions of greenhouse gases by the end of the century. And that is something that would give us a high assurance of keeping temperature increase below 2 degrees Celsius. And stabilization of atmospheric concentrations require moving away from the baseline regardless of the mitigation. So in other words, business as usual is certainly not an option for us. Now, this is again a synthesis diagram. On the left, we show reasons for concerns on several systems on this planet. On the right, we see the cumulative CO2 emissions, and it's really cumulative emissions which are leading to the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the bottom part, which shows us annual emissions which correspond to those cumulative CO2 emissions in the scenarios that we have developed and used for this assessment. So this again gives us a synthesized view of what's going to happen and how the risks that we are imposing on the climate are directly linked to values related to emissions of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. Limiting temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius would require measures do exist to achieve this substantial emissions reduction. And we need a combination of adaptation and substantial and sustained reductions in greenhouse gases. Now, implementing reductions in greenhouse gas emissions poses substantial technological, economic, social, and institutional challenges, but delaying mitigation will substantially increase the challenges associated with limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius, because the costs will go up enormously if we keep delaying things. And as you rightly said, sir, that the cost of inaction will be horrendously higher than the cost of action. What are the measures that we must adopt? More efficient use of energy, and this would also apply to the energy-consuming sectors, transport, buildings, industry. Greater use of low-carbon and no-carbon energy, improved carbon sinks, lifestyle and behavioral changes. All of these are options that we need. And actually, the cost would be the median value of the cost in taking these mitigation actions, we have estimated would be about 0.06% of the global GDP if we were to implement them. And this really translates into delayed but not foregone growth. An estimated cost does not account for the benefits of reduced climate change, and unmitigated climate change would create increasing risks to economic growth, because there would be impacts also on economic growth. Just as an example, extreme events don't only affect lives and property, they also hit economic activities rather seriously. And these are the choices we have. The right-hand side without additional mitigation gives you very high temperatures and therefore all kinds of associated impacts. The left side is with substantial mitigation, and that's the choice we should exercise. So it's really a question of exercising those choices. This report gives us a scientific basis, a very robust scientific basis, and I hope the global community would take it seriously. And once again, I express my deep gratitude to you, sir, for giving us encouragement and inspiration through your presence and your support of the scientific community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patchy. And we'll now open the press conference for questions. And as the Secretary-General has to leave before the end of the press conference, I'll take questions for him first. Danish television, Søren Vestergaard, please. Do you want to, can you wait for them?
Oh, sorry. Søren Moon from Danish National Broadcasting Corporation. I'd like to address you, Mr. Secretary General. We now know the report, and we hear that there are severe and irreversible damages. Why are you still an optimist?
As I said, we have seen the deadly effects to many places around the world. This global system of our Earth is having really a high temperature. So when your child is sick with the temperature, you have to take all medication and, if necessary, bring to doctors. This is what we have to do now. If I compare with our human body conditions, we have to first lower the temperature as you will do to your children. There should be no temperature, first of all. That is what we are doing. That requires a massive and urgent and immediate action. We have to mobilize all financial resources. I was very much encouraged when I convened the summit meeting on September 23rd. There were many business leaders, world-class business leaders. They pledged at least $200 billion for green economic development as well as climate-friendly investment. Yesterday here in Copenhagen, with the hosting by a foreign minister and the environment, the climate minister, I was able to have in-depth discussions with the business leaders here. They are all committed. And I was very much encouraged that all business community leaders who were in New York, they were very much committed. As you may know, United Nations has initiated this global compact where 8,000 world-class business companies are joining. They voluntarily created the Caring for Climate Action Group. They are taking their own actions. I have been urging those companies or firms who may use a lot of money, like pension fund or insurance companies. They are using this money, investing in any way. I'm asking them, please reduce your investment in coal, fossil fuel based economy to renewable energy, renewable sources of energy. Of course, we may have to live with all these fossil fuel energy resources, but we have to gradually to move to renewable sources. And I'm very happy to see that the Danish government is now hosting energy efficiency hub in the United Nations headquarters here in Copenhagen. We need everybody, even just individual citizens. A lot of the ways they can play actions. Just using this electricity and a single drop of water should be used sparingly to make our world a sustainable way. And this is what I'm sending messages to the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question? A quick question, Alistair Doyle of Reuters, please.
Thank you, Alistair from Reuters. Secretary General, 5 years ago in this city, of course, world leaders came together and failed to agree an agreement on climate change, despite having had an IPCC report in 2007. What's different this time? Is there any reason to be more optimistic about an agreement in Paris than there was a year before Copenhagen? Thank you.
In our life, one may always try And one may succeed, one may fail. We've been really trying to have global agreement on climate change, at least during the last 2 decades. We have now a Kyoto Protocol, very limited one. Our target, our priority is to have universal, very meaningful global climate change agreement by the end of next year. We had an extensive, in-depth discussions in 2009 in Copenhagen. But maybe looking back at that time, the world leaders might not have been fully ready to engage themselves. They were more focusing on national priorities rather than global priorities. Since then, we have been building upon what we had discussed in Copenhagen. All those important elements or partial agreements which we made in Copenhagen have been built upon in Copenhagen, then Durban in South Africa, Doha, Qatar, then Warsaw in Poland. Now we are going to Lima, Peru, and our final destination will be Paris by the end of next year. Now what had happened during that time, there were summit meetings which I hosted, and there were many UNFCCC COP meetings, and each time they have added their commitment. Finally, in Durban, 2011, the member states have agreed to agree on agreement. That was agree to agree. That was a good start, good beginning, good pledge. Now, it was reaffirmed in Doha 2012. Let's have an agreement. It was reaffirmed third time in Warsaw. Now, it will be, I'm sure, that fourth time agreed in Lima. Now, we are working very hard, including this UNFCCC meeting in Berlin last week, to have a draft text. We have been working without draft now. We've been just talking. Now, we are now trying to converging all this partial or whatever agreement or understandings into a draft. We will try our best to have this draft presented to the member state in Lima, December this year. I'm told that there has been quite smooth and quite good progress until now. But what is important is that they must strengthen and focus more on concentrate their efforts in having draft, and let this draft be ready for very serious, intense discussions and negotiations next year. I'm confident that we will do it. We can make it happen. This assessment report has made a huge impact. And in my summit meeting in September, the leaders of the world, more than 120 leaders participated. And almost 1,000 business leaders came and pledged their commitment. Thousands of civilians, they participated. And now these are clear that government, business communities, and civil societies are united. Well, how to balance all these different national priorities into a global vision-based and the solutions-based model, that is our work for the negotiators. Then the leaders have given clear directions to the negotiators. I think they have to work. And I'm confident that with your support, we can make it for humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. I think you may have to leave now, so we'll take a brief pause while you and your party leave. In fact, thank you very much once again for joining us today. Yes, yes, you stay. Yeah. You stay next to. Thank you. Well, we'll resume now. I'd like to invite questions now, specifically for Dr. Pachari on the report that we've just released. Any questions? Jesper Rahn from Ritzau, please.
Dr. Pachari, you explained to us that economic growth along with population growth are the main factors behind climate change. Will we ever see the UN recommend population control as a means of combating climate change, you think?
Well, in my view, you have to take a comprehensive view. Population is one of the drivers, but it's not the only driver. I mean, the other driver is associated with income, what you produce, what you consume. And I think we have to take a balanced and comprehensive view of exercising choices that deal with all the opportunities we have for reducing emissions of greenhouse gases. And on issues of population policy, of course, as far as I know, the UN does have the UNFPA, which deals with population issues. But obviously, this is a subject that lies within the ambit and the rights and goals of individual countries and societies. So I'm not too sure that the UN can lay down anything, but what we are providing by way of knowledge on the subject clearly shows all the drivers, which, as I said, include population, income, and everything related to income, production and consumption. So you have to look at the whole picture.
Thank you. Another question over there for Dr. Pachari, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Denise Crispin from O Estado de São Paulo, Brazilian newspaper. Mr. Pachari, I wanted to know how was solved the main question of the box 2 of the summary for policymakers. I know that the Saudi Arabian and other oil producers countries demanded to be considered as vulnerable countries. I wanted to know if the scientific community could accept this pledge and how could be the justification.
You see, as we mentioned in the introduction to this report, the whole report and the information it contains addresses issues related to Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention. So, you know, by putting all of that in a box, it would really have meant putting the whole report in a box. And I think we can do that. We can keep it in whatever boxes or containers we want. But it has all the information that is required for us to consider how science and scientific assessment links with Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention. And it was really in light of that we decided that this report itself gives you all the information that the global community is looking for from the scientific community on this particular subject.
Thank you. Just a reminder that if you're following the webcast and your media, you can submit questions to ipcc-questions@wmo.int. I'd like to throw this open really to everyone on the panel now. So do we have any questions? Carl, please, from AP.
Yes, hello. My question is for the Peruvian minister. I would like to hear your impression of how preparations are going for the COP summit and whether you think there are any important lessons coming from this report that will inform the negotiations. As the Secretary General just mentioned, it's a difficult process. It hasn't had huge results in the past 20 years. Do you think this report can make a difference?
Sure, thank you very much. We are in a time in which the signals are helping and supporting our efforts. And we're in a time in which what we should do it is build bridges between science, actions, and political decisions. And I think that what the IPCC has just launched, this synthesis report, is showing us three things. First, the confidence of the science, the certainty of information, and what it is more important, it is that there are options, policies options, so the governments have the possibility to take action. And also that bridges are important because we should take advantage of what the New York summit has left to us. Because in New York, what we heard and we saw, it is that the world, through different sectors and different actors, are taking actions and are moving forward. So for us to have in this front desk the science, the Secretary General that represent the results of the New York summit, and the COP debate, it is the good way. It is what we do need to do to move towards success, not only in Lima, but into Paris. And let me say that we are in a very different process in comparison of what we had in Copenhagen 5 years ago. Because now we are working more closer to the science. Secondly, we are recognizing more actors, business sector, civil society, indigenous peoples. Third, we are in a time in which we are recognizing the domestic actions because the national contributions are going to bring to us this balance between top-down and bottom-up. Fourth, we have the GCF, and we hope that in the next 2 weeks in Berlin, we can hear good pledges, strong pledges as a very good political signal for this process. And fifth, no, with that four, I'm saying it's okay. So it is very different. And because of that, I'm sure that we are going to succeed in Lima, and we're moving towards success in Paris. I'm completely sure that we're going to have an agreement by the end of the next year.
Thank you. Patchy, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I just want to mention, I think for the Honorable Minister to fly all the way from Lima to be present over here is a very eloquent expression of the importance he places on the science of climate change and the work of the IPCC. And I've been saying for some years now that I wish the negotiations took a little closer view of the scientific assessment of the IPCC. And for the minister to be here, I think is an indicator that that's going to happen. And I must mention that in the middle of the last month, he had organized a major meeting in Lima of all the journalists from Latin America and the Caribbean region. And he insisted that I come there and address them. And that was really a very satisfying experience. So I think COP20 is in very good hands with my dear friend. Yeah.
Thank you. Questions? Damien, please. Guardian.
Hi, Damien Carrington from The Guardian. A question for Dr. Pachauri and the panel, which is that given the slides you showed with the carbon budget, 65% completed, do you agree with the suggestion that 2/3 of fossil fuel reserves which currently exist in the world on companies' books are unburnable?
Well, I would also ask some of my colleagues, the co-chairs of the working group present over here, but what we have provided by way of options is a menu that includes energy efficiency and including changes in demand in the sectors where energy is consumed on a large scale. We've talked about renewable energy. We've talked about carbon capture and storage. We've also said that in the absence of carbon capture and storage, then power generation from fossil fuels would need to be phased out by the end of this century if we want to maintain the 2 °C limit of temperature increase. So, I don't think one can translate the findings of this report into fossil fuel assets becoming redundant or whatever, because with carbon capture and storage, it's entirely possible that fossil fuels can continue to be used on a large scale. But, there's a whole list of choices that the world has available. And I think different countries and different societies will exercise those choices based on their national interests. But I hope most dominantly based on the global interest, because, you know, we all live on this planet. And I think the very good thing that the Secretary General of the UN said during his opening statement on the 23rd of September is that, you know, there's really no plan B, because there is no planet B. There is only one planet that we're on. And I think national actions will have to keep that in mind.
Does one of the co-chairs want to add to that? Would you? Yeah, perhaps Ottmar Edenhofer, co-chair of Working Group 3 on fossil fuel redundancy.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to complement the arguments of Dr. Pachauri. So the first important message is that there's a limited carbon budget available. And this limited carbon budget, which is available, reflects the most important scarcity in the 21st century. It's not the scarcity of the fossil fuels which matter, it's the scarcity of the limiting disposal space of the atmosphere. And one of the huge challenges is that this scarcity has to be reflected in the prices on the market, so that every consumer, every investor, every firm has to take into account this future scarcity, and it is up to them to decide to what extent renewables, energy efficiency, carbon capture and storage is then the most competitive and the most viable option. And this is what we have explored in our report.
I just want to mention something. Sheikh Yamani, who used to be the oil minister of Saudi Arabia, and who in a different incarnation I've had the privilege of giving an award to, actually said that the Stone Age didn't end because there were no stones on this earth.
Questions? Irene Hell.
It's Irene Hell. I report for German and British press. Mr. Pachauri, you did groundbreaking work on making the world known what's going to happen. The Secretary General has been so optimistic. So do you really think with the help of the business community you finally can limit the increase of temperature? And for those who are not scientists, can you point out two simple scenarios what's going to happen? Yes, if we get the global carbon deal and we reduce the emissions, this is the one scenario. And secondly, if we don't get it, what will happen to the planet? Thank you so much.
Well, the groundbreaking work has been done by all these ladies and gentlemen. I mean, the scientific community, those who have led the scientific process, my colleagues in the IPCC. I mean, as I've said on an earlier occasion, I'm merely the bearded face of the IPCC. And it's really all the scientists who are responsible for whatever has been done. But yes, we need to ensure that this message that scientists are providing is heard not only by governments and politicians, but something that also reaches out to business leaders, to civil society, to research and academia. And I may say that one of the merits of the synthesis report and the summary for policymakers of the synthesis report is that this document can easily be read and absorbed by a CEO of a major company flying, say, between London and Paris, or preferably traveling by train between London and Paris. So, this is what we hope will happen, because it's very clear that the task that we face is not one confined only to politicians and political leaders. This is something which engages and should involve all stakeholders. And I hope that this will happen.
Michel, do you want to add something to that?
Actually, it's not really on the last question, but it's a reflection on the question asked earlier by Reuters to the UN Secretary General, and also touched upon by some of the other questions. What has changed since Copenhagen 2009? What has changed in the fifth assessment report is that every time there's a new IPCC assessment report, the message is more precise, it is stronger, and the confidence level is significantly stronger. Now we are at the point where some of the excuse which was used in Copenhagen 2009 for not taking action, which was basically some uncertainties on some of the questions, although there was a lot of evidence on many of them, now is no longer valid. It's no longer tenable. Ignorance can no longer be used as an excuse for no action. And this is a fundamental difference compared to 2009. Why? Because in 50 years from now, actually even in 30 years from now, governments, but not only governments, decision makers at all levels can be held accountable for the decisions which are not taken now, because knowledge is there. We know. We have no excuse for no action. Thank you.
Minister.
Let me complement the idea of Dr. Gerard about the importance of this report. I think that this report strengthens and recognizes the importance of the two principles that are in the base of the negotiation: sense of urgency and level of ambition. I think this is the basis for that, and it is the only way to move forward.
Thank you. We have a question related to that from Peter Clark of the Financial Times in London. So the question is, the summary for policymakers says delaying additional mitigation to 2030 will substantially increase the technological, economic and other challenges associated with limiting warming to less than 2 degrees over this century. Is the IPCC in effect saying that world leaders have just 15 years to start taking meaningful action to keep the climate safe?
Well, I think it's obvious that we need to start taking action, but I don't think we can wait even till 2030. Because even if you want to develop new technologies, unless you have a framework, unless you have the right kinds of market signals, government policies that would bring about innovation in the direction that would help in solving this problem, this will not happen overnight. But the good news is that we've got plenty of options available to us today which can be implemented effectively and in an economically viable manner. I might say that in 2011, the IPCC had brought out a special report on renewable energy sources and climate change mitigation. And that showed, in fact, there's a very clear diagram over there, which shows the range of costs for renewable sources of energy for specific applications where there's already an overlap. In other words, in some cases, renewable energy, for instance, is economically viable even today. So I would say that, yes, we need to start moving as quickly as possible. And the other aspect that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at strictly the costs of mitigation is what the Secretary General referred to as the cost of inaction. You know, several of the costs in terms of the impacts of climate change, of the increase in frequency and intensity of extreme events, cannot even be quantified because there are enormous impacts on ecosystems. There would be a loss of cultural impacts. There would be a loss of several social factors that you really can't take into account. And therefore, I would submit that this report, by virtue of the fact that it's a synthesis report, gives you a comprehensive view of not merely mitigation, but also adaptation imperatives, particularly when it comes to not taking action in the next few years.
Thank you. Dr. Leomeyer, please.
If I may add to that last question, you cannot give this exact time, but to give you some data, emissions need to be reduced by 40 to 70% in 2050 and would need to go to zero or even below zero by 2100 if the world wants to limit the global warming to 2 degrees. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have another question in the room, please? So I have another. have another one from people following the webcast. This is from Ben Webster, who is the environment editor of The Times in London. Please, could you explain what you mean by emissions possibly needing to fall below zero by 2100? How far below zero might be necessary?
May I turn to Ottmar to respond to that question, my colleague who's co-chair of Working Group 3.
Yeah, thank you very much. It depends. That's the scientific. It depends what pathway we will choose in the next 2 decades. When we start with emission reduction immediately, and we are on a less carbon-intensive pathway, so then we need less negative emissions at the end of the century. If we follow now a very carbon-intensive pathway in the next 2 decades, we need more negative emissions, afforestation, the combination of bioenergy and CCS. It depends very much on the decisions we will take in the next 2 decades. And I would like to complement or provide 2 numbers. So when we will be successful to achieve an agreement in Paris, so from 2030 on, the annual emission growth rate reduction would be -3%. If we would follow just the Cancun pledges, so the emission reduction requirements after 2030 will increase to -6%, which is unprecedented in economic history. And this would force us to implement even more risky mitigation options. For example, we had in the report an intensive discussion to what extent bioenergy should and can be used in a sustainable manner, in a sustainable way. And the longer we wait, the more carbon intensive the pathway is in the next 2 decades, the more negative emissions we need, and the more riskier mitigations options we need to achieve a low stabilization target.
Thank you. Any questions in the room? There, middle.
Yeah, hi, Peter Levering, Bloomberg News. Mr. Pachauri, you mentioned that the economic impact of mitigation strategies would be about 0.06% of global GDP. Now, but how would that distribute geographically? I mean, who would take the brunt of this?
Well, that precisely is the issue that's before the negotiators as part of actions under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But the good news is that, I think a lot is happening, not on the scale that may be required to limit emissions of greenhouse gases, to see that we follow a pathway that would ensure keeping temperature increase to below 2 degrees Celsius. But much is happening in towns and cities, in this very country where we are. Denmark has very ambitious targets. Just a week ago, the EU has set some targets. So it's very difficult to say how this can be distributed in terms of actions across the globe, because that's really beyond the scope of science. What we have provided is a range of options, and we've also looked at what the implications would be for each of those options. But that's something which really the process under the Framework Convention has to deal with. The only point I'd like to make is that we have shown that there are co-benefits in taking some of these actions, and I think countries and decision makers need to take those into account. I don't know, yeah.
How did you come up with the estimation of the cost? I mean, obviously, the cost of mitigation...
Could you use the microphone, please?
Yes, but it turned off. Okay, sorry, me and technology. It was just... I was just wondering how you came up with the estimate, since, I mean, obviously, mitigation strategies have different costs depending on where you are on the planet, and doing one thing in Western Europe is obviously, or could be more costly than doing it in Africa.
Sure. But, I think what we've taken is a comprehensive global view of costs. So I would say that, to the extent that literature exists on this subject all over the world, that has been taken into account, and there's a range of scenarios that have been assessed in arriving at costs. In fact, maybe I should ask one of my co-chairs from Working Group 3 to respond to this. They can give you more elaborate details on the scenarios that have been used and the elements of costs that have been included in this assessment.
Yeah, thank you very much. So indeed, we have fundamentally estimated the macroeconomic costs, and these cost estimations are average consumption losses, and that's clear that the literature is not very rich being explicit about the distributional impacts of these costs. So the cost in the very short term, so to start and to develop those technologies, might be a little bit higher compared to the average. And there are definitely some countries which suffer more from mitigation and other countries suffer less from mitigation. What we have done so far is we have come up with the following conclusions. The first one is the macroeconomic mitigation costs depend on the stringency of the target. But what is much more important, it depends on the availability of the technologies. So some technologies are very important to contain the macroeconomic costs and to reduce the distributional impacts and the distributional problems. So for example, one aspect is that bioenergy in combination with carbon capture and storage has a huge potential to reduce the macroeconomic mitigation costs, or the other way around. If these technologies are only available at a limited scale, the risk that these costs, the mitigation costs, will increase are substantial. So on the other hand, so there are a multitude of options for renewables, and in many countries it is quite easy to substitute nuclear power by renewables and the other way around. So, and we made very, very clear that mitigation and even stringent mitigation pathways provides many countries or most countries a real reasonable choice about their precise portfolio of mitigation options and a precise energy mix. So there is a choice. In some countries, you might have a high share of renewables and a combination with high energy efficiency. In other countries, carbon capture and storage and nuclear power might be a viable option.
Any questions in the room? So I have a question from Japan, from Satoru Mizuguchi of the Housing Tribune magazine. 3 parts. Could Dr. Pachauri please repeat the costs of inaction compared to the cost of action? Could you elaborate on your statement in the press release, all we need is the will to change? And are there any good examples to change the will for transforming the energy system and or land use at national levels?
Well, I would say if you look at changes in the energy system, I think Japan is a remarkable example, and I'm only mentioning the fact that, if you look at data in terms of economic output and energy consumption, clearly Japan would be different from several other countries. But I'm only citing that as an example. I'm not for a moment trying to suggest that anybody should emulate any other country. These are choices that governments have to make themselves, societies have to make themselves. But the point I was trying to make is that even today, you have substantial differences in terms of energy intensity of economic growth. You have significant differences in emissions per capita, emissions per unit of output. And really speaking, we have to learn from each other. One of the things that could facilitate some of the actions that are required to be taken if we want to limit temperature increase to, say, 2 degrees Celsius or whatever target we set, is international cooperation. International cooperation would be a facilitating factor in bringing about the kinds of outcomes that hopefully can help us meet with the challenge of climate change.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, in that case, one more there from...
Maybe you help me. Most of the audiences don't know too much about CO2 and what it means not to act. Is there any chance to explain it in very simple words? First, what happens if we manage to get a global carbon deal? And scenario A, scenario B, if we fail? Thank you.
Well, we have tried to provide that in this report, as have indeed in much greater detail the working group reports. But what you have over here is a comprehensive view. For instance, there is this figure SPM 10 in this particular report, which shows what would be the risk assessment and reasons for concern related to different levels of concentration. You know, I projected that figure. And you see with the elliptical shapes that you have over there, the kinds of ranges of those particular variables which would be associated with different levels of concern on specific sectors that have been assessed over there. So my submission would be that if we look at this report, and particularly some of the figures that are provided, you get a fairly clear and comprehensive view of what kinds of risks associated with the kinds of impacts that we are going to face, and what are the kinds of conditions that would bring about those risks. And therefore, you get a much better idea of how you might limit emissions of greenhouse gases to minimize those risks. So may I say that this is one of the benefits of a synthesis report, because you're able to link both the impacts of climate change and mitigation options. But one conclusion that comes out very clearly is that we need both adaptation and mitigation. One or the other is not really a solution for this challenge.
Thank you. Any further questions? Well, in that case, thank you very much for coming today, and you can find the report on our website, ipcc.ch, with other materials there. Thank you very much, Dr. Pachauri and the other Honourable Minister and other panellists. Thank you.